So my name is Ellie Andrews, and I'm the UC Cooperative Extension Specialty Crops Advisor for Sonoma, Marin, and Napa counties. So I cover all of the crops that are not grapes in our counties. So that's orchard crops, vegetable crops, emerging specialty crops, niche things that people are starting to try out. And there's a lot of questions these days about what else we can grow here in our region besides grapes. And there's some really amazing fig trees. So I'm excited to learn more about figs and fig production and what that might look like here. And so with that, I'll hand it over to you, Phoebe.
Thanks. I will say, so this is geared towards commercial production, fresh fig, since the dried fig requires access to processors, which are basically located in the valley. I am also a horticulturalist by training, and so this is primarily going to focus on uh, how to grow the plants, nutrition, and that sort of thing. And uh, we'll do a speed walkthrough of the pests that might be a problem for fresh fig production. So, which is basically birds. All right, so let me. Oh, shoot, I have to share my screen and then hit the presentation. You'd think I'd done this before, but okay. Let's see. Okay, so I have it arranged that I should be able to see if folks raise their hand. So please do that. Use that function if you want to ask some questions. So I am the Orchard System Advisor for Madera Merced counties, which is where basically 90% of the U.S. production of figs is located. It's a very small industry. Last I checked, it's about 7,000 acres. So I'm going to go a little bit over the history. I'm going to try not to spend too much time on it, the biology, and then get into production. So this is a very ancient fruit. It's one of the earliest domesticated crop plants, and I've heard that it's the first domesticated tree plant because it's pretty easy to propagate. It's very easy to root from cuttings. The fruit itself it does not store very well. You're lucky if you can get 2 weeks after you pick the fruit. And so, for the most part, it's stored dried. Domestication resulted in bigger fruit, the development of artificial pollination. I'm going to talk about fig pollination later. And more importantly, the selection of cultivars that exhibit what we call persistence. And I will explain that when I talk about pollination. So, binomial Ficus carica, so it's part of the Ficus genus, which is very big. So there are some unique traits as part of the family it's part of. So these plants produce latex and they have compound fruit. And so Ficus itself is a big genera, and there's a lot of the pollinators tend to be very specific, and that's the case with Ficus carica. So figs have been traded for a very long time because, again, they've been domesticated for over 1,000 years. Something that I think a lot of folks they may or may not have heard is there are a lot of varieties. There's a lot of regional varieties. But some work done by a fig specialist with the University of California in, I believe, the 1940s. This is before they even knew what DNA was. He did some nice work with just looking at the figs, the trees and the fruit themselves, and he basically figured out that, well, what actually happened is that you have still a lot, but a smaller number of varieties that have been traded around, and each little village or region would give a unique name to these varieties. But so what that means is that you have one variety that has it could have upwards of 20 different names depending on where it was grown. So figs also have a local history in California. So people hear about Fresno being founded on raisin production. So the boosterism that was done to try to get people to move from the eastern U.S. to the western U.S. It was done in the Fresno area as well, and that was raisin and figs. And there's also a large Armenian diaspora that settled in the area too, and so figs are, a part of their cuisine. And so there was a lot of fig production and fig consumption. The acreage, I believe, peaked around 50,000 acres, which may seem small when we're thinking about today's standards and the fact that California agriculture tends to be dominated by tree crops. We have over 1.5 million acres, but it was not the case in the fig heyday. Back in the 40s and 50s. So 50,000 acres was actually quite large of an industry. So fig consumption in the United States, there's not a culture of consuming fresh figs here. And figs were primarily grown for canning, which who eats canned fruit of any kind anymore? And they grew them for dried fig production, both to eat and also to put in fig cookies, which again, I remember I got fig Newtons when I was a kid, but I know there's that one company that's kind of trying to bring the fig cookie back, but for the most part, we just don't really consume that anymore. So um, the California fig industry has also been at least dried. It's hard to compete with Turkey, which is the world's largest fig producer for dried fruit. So there are two crops of edible figs. Not every single fig variety produces this. Black Mission is probably, it's the biggest part of the industry and it does produce the two crops. And I'm going to go into a little bit over why this happens. So there's the Breba, which is the first crop that ripens around June, and the main crop, which ripens from August through October. So the Breba is formed from reproductive buds that are formed in the previous season, don't complete development, and then complete development. They overwinter and complete development the next year. The main crop forms from reproductive buds produced in the season. So what that means is that figs are born on current season's wood, which is very unusual for tree crops. Usually you have flowers that are born on 1-year-old wood, so the branch grows, the flower buds are initiated, and then the next year they bloom. Or they're born on spurs, which take several years to develop. So I'm going to be calling figs a fruit because, colloquially they are, but botanically they're not a fruit. They're actually reproductive tissues. And so they're produced at the leaf axil as the branch grows. Because they're produced as the branch grows, trees can have fruit at all stages of maturity at a single point in time. And so this requires multiple harvests. So if you are producing fresh fruit, maybe you don't have big acreage. That's nice because you can supply fresh fruit over a long period of time. But if you're a dried fruit grower, you don't just have one harvest, you have multiple harvests as figs successively ripen and fall off the tree. So the technical name for the fig fruit is a syconium. It is a reproductive structure. You can kind of think of it as almost like the opposite of a strawberry, where the red, fleshy, sweet part that we eat is reproductive tissue produced by the mother plant. The flowers and the tiny little things that people think are seeds are the actual fruit. So the fig is the opposite. The flowers are born on the inside of the syconium, and the pollinator crawls in through a hole at the base called an ostiole. Her wings are ripped off. She can't complete her life cycle, but she picks up pollen when she leaves one fig, deposits it as she's crawling around looking for a place to lay her eggs, and then basically dies inside the fruit. But the fig wasp is very, very tiny. You would never know you're eating it. So, man, I'm going to be throwing a lot of terms around. It's just figs are very complicated. So there are figs that are still from Ficus carica that are, I think, technically edible, but they don't taste good and are also filled with wasps, called capra figs. And so they are what the fig wasps actually survive on. There's a couple of reasons. One is that the flower type inside the capra fig is the right structure for the wasp to be able to successfully lay her eggs in. The other is because capra figs actually have 3 crops in a year, and the fig wasp's lifespan is short enough that you can't quite get a generation going from one year to the next on the edible fig, but you can on a capra fig. So what happens then is that if there's pollination that's being managed, there is one crop of the capra fig that coincides with when the main crop needs to be pollinated. So you will take, or a grower will take fruit from a capra fig orchard and bring it into the edible fig orchard. And just as like kind of fun little side tangent, from what I heard is that when figs were first trying to be introduced in California, they were bringing over cultivars that required pollination, and they observed people in these, rural villages in the Mediterranean doing this, and, people being what they were in the early 1900s, They were like, "Oh my God, look at these dumb villagers! They're doing all the superstitious things." But later they realized that actually, these figs that they were bringing from one orchard to another actually contained the wasps that were needed to pollinate. So when you eat a fig, you will often feel like a hard little ball or several of them inside the fruit. That's the actual technical fruit. They're drupelets. So again, figs, the edible portion is a zirconium, but I am probably never going to use that term again in this talk. So there are four types of fig trees, and I'm not talking about cultivars. And they have to do with whether or not they require pollination. So there's the Smyrna, which is an obligate. It requires pollination. With the zirconium are not pollinated. The flowers inside the zirconium, they will upsize and fall off the tree. There's a San Pedro, does not require pollination for the breva, but it does require pollination for the main crop. Don't ask me why. I don't know. And then there's what we call the common or persistent fig. And so this is the type of fig that is in commercial production today. It does not require pollination for either crop. They don't always produce breva, and it's not parthenocarpy because parthenocarpy is the formation of fruit without pollination. And so fruit are not formed in the zirconium if there's no pollination in these persistent varieties. What happens is that the tree just continues to put sugars and develop that reproductive tissue so that you have an edible thing to eat, but there's no actual fruit inside. And the last type of fig is the capra fig, which again is where the wasp lives. So wasp pollination in California is obsolete. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the variety that was used here for the Smyrna type fig that was used for production just doesn't yield as well as other cultivars. But a really big reason too is that the fig wasp would introduce this disease called endosepsis, which I believe is a fungal disease, and it was just a huge problem. And there was some research trying to find ways to reduce endosepsis. I believe one thing that researchers came up with is like dusting the wasps as they come out of the capra figs so that any spores on them are killed. But what the industry just ended up doing was they just moved to common type figs. So moving on, a little bit more on the fruit itself. So figs soften as they age and they drop from the tree naturally. And so dried figs are actually machine harvested, at least here in California. So the partially dry fruit fall off the tree onto the ground and they sit there for up to 2 weeks. And then the fruit is harvested a lot like almonds are. So they're blown to round middles, they're windrowed, they're picked up and binned by a processor shipped to a processor. The fruit are cleaned, they're sterilized. If they're too dry or a little too moist, the moisture content might be changed. I believe there are some growers who will have hand-picked fruit here and tray dry them, and they may or may not be sulfured, but that's not the majority of dried fig production. In some areas of the world, I've seen photos, I haven't seen the production system, but I've seen photos where they'll put out nets underneath trees to capture the fruit so they don't actually land on the ground. But off-ground harvest is what is used here in California. So fresh figs themselves, again, this is what I'm mostly going to focus on. They are what's called a climacteric fruit, which ethylene is a ripening signal in them. But unlike some fruit, they don't continue to ripen off the tree. Basically, once you pick them, that's the sweetest they're going to get. And that does have a consequence because figs are picked, like most other fruits, a little bit before we call it commercial maturity. So they're not quite as tasty as they could be, but they last longer, which is really important for figs. The full fruit has developed color, but the final color is not complete. So what's that mean? Black mission figs are typically picked when they're purple, but a fully ripe black mission is, well, technically it is still purple, but it's almost black. And so that has a consequence for the fresh fruit market because consumer testing has been done with fresh figs. And they found that consumers kind of don't like, the acceptance of commercial ripe fruit was about 56%. This is where they had people, I think they set up shop in a Whole Foods, they had people taste figs. And they're asking like, would you buy this and what do you prefer? And they found that people love tree ripe figs. The acceptance numbers are similar to cherries, which is a very, very popular tree fruit. But consumers wouldn't buy them because they're a little wrinklier, they're softer, and quite frankly, they'd last for a very short period of time off a tree when they're that ripe. Um, I do wonder if there's a market for a small grower to get these tree ripe fruit, really quickly to consumers. Because again, if you've ever tried, I mean, any fruit that you try off the tree when it's fully ripe is just there's no comparison to what you buy in the grocery store. But it's when those figs start to they desiccate slightly, maybe they're a little wrinklier, but they have their full sugar development. Like, man, that is a really delicious thing to eat. But people just aren't used to that, and so same thing for powdered state apricots. Powdered state apricots aren't really good fresh fruit, but that's what everyone buys and wants because that's what they're used to. When there's way tastier apricot varieties out there. Okay. When you harvest fruit, the fruit should be firm, mostly latex free, although latex free also has to do with whether or not you leave this little bit of stem on. Like any other fruit, you want to harvest them early in the morning. You need to specifically train pickers to not damage the fruit. Any fruit you don't want to damage, but again, figs are so fragile and they decay so easily that it's really critical to make sure the fruit is perfect. There's the tiny little bit of stem, so you have to train them how to pick it correctly so they're not ripping off that portion. So I have a photo down here where you can see they just ripped off the top of that skin. And because they will produce some latex, you have to provide hand protection to workers. I've picked fresh figs for a couple different research projects, and man, after an hour, if you are not wearing gloves, it's horrible and itchy, and just yeah, they need to have protection. Okay, so the big limiting factor for fresh fig sales is because this fruits last for about 1 to 2 weeks. There's been some research on trying to extend the shelf life. Because the market is so small, I just don't know if any companies are really going to take up commercialization. But there's been some research on sulfur dioxide emitting pads, which I'm not sure would be organically acceptable. A researcher at UC Merced recently looked at using a small ozone gas generator, and that worked to improve the fresh life or shelf life of fresh figs. Um, he believes in producing things that it's not too expensive and growers can use pretty easily. So if you're really interested, I can put you in touch with the engineer. I'm not sure, how it would work out for your operations, but there is something that could potentially be used. And I believe ozone gas is okay in the organic market, although I am a farm advisor. Check with your distributor to make sure that's the case, or whoever certifies your orchard. But in general, pick early in the morning and ensure your storage containers are clean and smooth to reduce damage. Gosh, I should have had a photo, but the best packages for packaging fruit are kind of similar to what you see for, peaches. You might have this open box where there's like this little tray where every single fruit has a nestling. It's kept separate from the other fruit around it. That's the very best way to package figs. But of course, I'm sure we've all seen the clamshells and like Trader Joe's where figs can be processed or sold in there. Um, all right. So moving on to production, I guess any questions about figs before we move on? Okay. So, fig production. Let's see. I'm going to give a huge caveat here. Because the fig industry is so small, there just hasn't been a huge amount of research in California production systems for a very long time. There is research that has been going on in other parts of the world. But a lot of these areas are, California, we have high input production systems that rely on high yields. And a lot of these are areas where figs are produced are low input production systems where the trees may or may not be fertilized. They may not be irrigated much outside of rain irrigation and rain-fed irrigation, so or no irrigation, so rain-fed trees. So it can be really hard to sometimes pull conclusions from some of the literature out there. All right, so how to select a site to plant figs. So they are weeds in riparian areas. So if you have okay soil and lots of water, they'll grow like crazy. Um, they have a very low chilling requirement, which is good. Uh, I believe it's 100 chill units, if I remember correctly, maybe 300. But regardless, there's no issues with figs leafing out in California. They're fairly frost tolerant. They can get frost damage, I think. So I am in my 10th year on the job. I think in 2018 we had a hard frost in some areas where some fig trees did get damaged, but that's really the only time I've heard of frost damage to figs. So this is a fruit that does best in areas with hot, dry summers, which I think is not a problem in most areas of California. But if you're, on the foggy coast or maybe in an intermountain area, figs may not be the best choice. And like any other orchard crop, you want to select sites with good soil and abundant high quality water. And I will just discuss irrigation requirements later. So figs are nice because they're actually tolerant of many soil types. They have a fairly shallow root system, so you can get away with growing them in areas where the root zone is restricted. But just like with any crop, I mean, you can grow almonds in soils that have a hard pan, like 4 feet below the soil surface, but you have to be really good at irrigation to make sure that you aren't creating saturated conditions. And if you're growing figs in this sort of area too, where you haven't ripped, you have a hard pan that's preventing water movement. Um, if we have a winter like we did in 2022 to 2023, where it was one of the rainiest winters on record, you might have water sitting in that soil for a really long time. They don't tend to like growing in soils with a lot of calcium carbonates, and they don't do super well in fairly acidic soils. They're somewhat salt tolerant. They're I've never been able to find an in-field salinity tolerance trial, but in general, they're probably about between almonds and walnuts, which are a very salt intolerant tree species, and pistachios, which uh, technically is only considered moderately salt tolerant, but pistachios begin losing yields much at a much higher level than almonds and walnuts. And figs are likely not tolerant to high boron levels, which I'm not sure what you tend to find in your area. But here, that's really only a problem in like the Cache Creek area of Yolo County on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, where we have a mountain range that was formed by marine or formed from soil that used to be a marine, an ancient ocean. All right, so orchard design, it's not really unique compared to other fruit orchards. Spacing has gotten a lot closer over time. So here in the San Joaquin Valley, I will tell you I've observed. I tend to see fresh fruit only orchards planted pretty close. Some you can get like Black Mission, where the fruit is good for both dried and fresh. They'll set up the orchard for dried, and pickers will come through and pick fresh fruit as well. So that you might have slightly wider spacing there. But let's see. So, square, rectangular, modified hedgerow, it's just kind of dependent on what you want. Just make sure that the row spacing is wide enough so you can have tractors coming through. Here, most fig growers also grow almonds. And so, between row spacing tends to be between 20 and 22 feet. See, I see a couple questions in the chat. Okay, so it sounds like there's some other areas with high boron in the state. Okay, so like any other orchard crop, know your site history, soil sample, dig backhoe pits, depending on the size of the plot you're putting in, to assess the soil condition. No tree crop does well with heavily compacted soil, which is what you're going to have if you have land that's been in agricultural production and you're using farming equipment on it. So deep ripping might be a good idea, especially if you're, switching from a crop that has a different spacing. You don't want to be planting your tree row in a former drive row. And backhoe pits are also a nice way to understand drainage issues because again, well, figs will they do fine with lots of water, but you don't want them sitting in stagnant water. So you might want to rip or till before planting. Whether or not you do deep ripping to eliminate soil pans is up to you. I've looked into the research on it. Whether or not trees grow better with deep ripping is, I think, up for debate. Where deep ripping to break up soil pans comes in handy is, again, years where you have an incredible amount of water falling from the sky and there's nowhere for the water to go. So it just sits in the soil for months and months and causes problems with root asphyxiation. Okay, one thing I did want to mention is that figs are sensitive to pathogenic nematodes. And unlike a lot of our other tree species, there are no rootstocks available for figs. So we don't have anything that we know for sure, can tolerate a specific type of nematode. So ring, root knot, and lesion nematodes have all been reported to reduce tree establishments, and I don't really have good solutions. You could fumigate depending on the size of the property, but if you're in an area that, you're surrounded by houses, regulations really may limit where you can fumigate. And I just think it's unclear if the economics work out. So even in, when almonds were doing pretty well, there were growers who opted to not fumigate when planting a new orchard because it is so expensive. But if you want to make sure that you're creating the vast, so fumigation works by, killing pathogens or knocking them back in a small area. It gives the trees a couple years to get established. And so by the time that the roots grow out into nematode infested soil or the nematodes move back in, they have enough roots to support them. Um, so again, it's just, I don't know if the economics work out for figs. Soil solarization, I mean, it works. It only really affects the top foot of soil, which if you're thinking about a tree crop, those roots are not going to stay in 1 foot for very long, maybe not even in the first year. And so I'm not sure that it would work out in that situation. The best thing to probably do is fallow with a cover crop. Make sure you sample your soil to find out what species of nematode you have, because not all cover crops are, plant a cover crop that does not host a nematode, so the nematodes basically starve to death, and not all cover crops are appropriate for this. I think Piper Sudan grass is more versatile. You might be able to grow it for forage, but you do have to have the land out of production for a little while. And I will say I have seen a newly planted fig orchard hammered by nematodes. I know, this is just a backyard gardening case, but I have a fig tree that's being hammered by root knot nematodes. And so it will really severely impact growth for the first couple of years of life. And so if you are planting in a situation where you have pathogenic nematodes that are known to be a problem for figs, I would really seriously consider fallowing the land, growing something that doesn't host them for a couple of years to try to knock down those populations so those trees can get established. Because again, in any of these situations, you're not eliminating the pathogen, you're just knocking back the numbers enough so the trees can get established so they have enough of a root system by the time the nematodes start causing problems. Okay, how to plant trees. Figs is no different from other fruit trees. You want to make sure that the root collar is at the soil surface. Plant in the fall through the spring. Summer planted trees will struggle if they even survive. Make sure the irrigation system gets into the root zone of the potted tree and monitor newly planted trees. Figs are pretty drought tolerant. We don't have good data on it, but you don't want to be stunting these trees by stressing them out. Okay, pruning. We really don't have any recent pruning literature, at least here in California. I know, there's some cool new production systems coming online for apples and cherries in other parts of the US. So the pruning recommendations I have are basically just use the old-fashioned quote unquote fruit tree pruning system where you have a vase-shaped tree, anywhere from 3 to 4 scaffolds that you select, you head the first dormant season, you select the scaffolds in the next. One thing I will add about figs is that for the fresh fruit production, their trend for orchards in general is to keep these trees as short as possible to eliminate the needs for ladders or at least tall ladders. So when I see, I can identify fig orchards very easily um, for if they're only for fresh fig production because the trees themselves, the structure that stays there from one year to the next, might only be 3 to 4 feet tall. These trees are kept tiny. And again, because figs are grown on first season or current season's wood, you'll have rapid growth, you'll have fruit production, and then you'll go through and chop everything off, mostly everything off, at the end of the dormant season. So again, you're keeping that fruit producing wood at hand picking height. So fresh fig orchards are a little different than dried fig orchards because the canopy is kept a little bit higher off the ground so that you can have room for equipment to go underneath and blow the fruit out. Um, yeah, so when you're cutting back to get at the end of the season, when you selected your scaffolds, um, you want to prune back to you have 3 to 4 basil buds that will grow the next season. So again, I don't have any like cool, neat tricks for pruning trees. It's just you have to keep in mind that you are encouraging current season's wood to be growing within hand picking height. You can also do rejuvenation pruning on figs. I mean, like any tree, cutting off a huge scaffold is going to really severely stress them out, but they'll have epicormic buds that will produce. Um, you just have to make sure to protect that wood from sunburn, which I'll go over when I cover abiotic disorders. Okay, so I'm not going to really talk about cultivars. Most of them are probably things you've heard of. So Black Mission, brown turkey. There were two UC bred varieties to try to replace Calamirna, one for the dried market, which was Sierra, one for the fresh market, which is Sequoia. Um, I don't know. I see people grow the panache. I have these photos because this was in a UC variety trial. I don't really have good advice on cultivars because again, a lot of it that's grown here in the Central Valley is for dried production. But in general, from what I've heard, the consumers like large fruit and they like purple fruit. Okay, moving on to abiotic disorders. Okay, so figs are sensitive to sunburn. Both the green-skinned fruit and the wood of any variety can be damaged by sunburn. So the best way to manage this is to ensure canopy coverage. So when you're pruning, again, make sure you leave basal buds so you have branches that push, that have leaves that protect the bark and the fruit. If you have to prune back really severely, use whitewash to protect exposed branches. And um, potassium deficiency can cause defoliation, and it causes defoliation in the summer. So try to keep your trees from becoming potassium deficient. Another more severe issue is splitting and cracking. So fig splitting is, when you might just have a little bit of the skin splits, but the fruit itself underneath stays intact. Cracking typically starts at the ostiole, and that is where the split goes through the flesh of the fruit itself. And that's a very serious issue for the fresh market because A, it decreases storage life, and B, I mean, I guess if the splitting isn't too bad, it might not be a problem, but consumers don't like damaged fruit, and so they don't want to buy that. So there's been a little bit of research that's been done here in the US and in Turkey that has some information on splitting and cracking. Unfortunately, I just don't have strong management guidelines, and I'll explain why. I also note that in the book that Ellie mentioned, I did write the nutrition chapter. And so a lot of what I did was go in and analyze the literature. So you're going to hear me. I'm not going to just talk about it. I'm going to talk about the problems with it too, because that's what I did for that book. But anyways, so there's one fairly, in terms of fig production, fairly recent research trial looking at irrigation as a way to manage um, cracking. And so what they found was that reducing irrigation during a certain point in time can reduce cracking. So just to give a little bit of background, so when we talk about fruits, fruits go through stages of growth. So stage one is cell division. You'll get, basically from bloom or uh, and pollination or lack thereof in figs. So the fruit grows in size. There's stage two, which is kind of called like the quiescent period, where there's development things happening, but the fruit itself doesn't change much in size. And then stage three is cell expansion. And then after that, you get ripening. So it's known across fruit in general that you can cut back on water during stage two and it doesn't impact yields too much. Now, since this research, again, so figs don't all ripen at the same time, what these researchers did is they picked a time when 25% of the fruit on a branch were in stage two, which in their time was, and for their varieties, was the first week of August. And so they cut back water. They compared full ET to 55%. Now, as I'm going to go over with the irrigation, we actually do not know how much water fresh figs need. And because these, I don't at all want to knock the research, but they are post-harvest physiologists. They're not agronomists or people who do the horticulture. So they didn't actually report how much water they applied. They did report stem water potential, but because we have no baseline stem water potential for figs, they took the trees, the stem water potentials ranged from -6 to -12 bars, but I can't tell you how stressed -12 bars are. I don't know if it's moderate stress, mild stress, but they did cut back on water during this time period and they reduced cracking. I believe one variety did have smaller fruit because they cut back on water. Fruit's really important for fresh fig production because you need water stress trees produce smaller fruit. But I believe the other variety they looked at, they saw no impact on fruit size. So what I would say is, again, I can't give really strong guidelines, but if you're producing figs, you see a lot of cracking, maybe examine your water applications during the summertime and see if you can cut back a little bit to try to reduce that. Plant nutrition has also been connected to fruit cracking. So calcium applications either to the soil or as a foliar spray have been reported to reduce fruit cracking, even if the calcium levels are high. These are research projects. So in one, they were looking at calcium chloride for foliar sprays. I don't know if you can get that as a commercial grower. And for the soil applications, they were looking at, calcium nitrate and calcium thiosulfate for soil applications. None of these are organically acceptable. I'm not sure what you can use in an organic situation because lime does have calcium, but you have to have an acidic soil to break that down or have that be broken down. But you can use calcium. There's a little bit of conflicting information on potassium. One study did look at the ratio of calcium and potassium ratios in the fruit, and they found that high ratios of potassium to calcium resulted in cracking. But part of the problem with the study is that they used different cultivars with known susceptibilities to cracking. And so what they're doing is they're conflating nutrient ratios in the fruit with cultivar. And so there's a lot of other things we know from other research in other crops, like water content, how fast cell expansion happens. And so I take this with a grain of salt, particularly because they don't actually report the leaf nutrient status of the trees. So we don't know if these trees were deficient or not in potassium. There's more research that shows that adequate potassium nutrition is actually reduces fruit cracking. So one US-based study used a combo of potassium and calcium thiosulfate, and they did find that yields were increased due to reduced cracking and splitting, and fruit quality improved. So technically, because they looked at the combo of these two, We can't say for sure, but they did increase potassium levels in the tree with this research, and they still found reduced fruit cracking. Other studies that are in these input production systems have found reduced fruit cracking. Um, and so I take these with a grain of salt again, because you might be dealing with situations where these trees are really nutrient deficient. Sorry, it sounds like someone has their sound on. If they could mute themselves. Um, but I would just say that maintaining adequate potassium is important.
Hey Phoebe, real quick, sorry to interrupt, but before we go to irrigation, would you mind checking out the chat real quick? We have two questions for you.
Okay, so the question is if you need to have some of the terminal buds that provide for the Breba crop. Yeah, you could do that, or you can have trees where you leave the branches intact. Um, yeah, so again, in the systems that I'm most familiar with, the Breba is typically harvested on Black Mission, which are also grown for dried. And so dried figs, they let grow very tall because anything that the pickers don't get, it just falls to the ground and it goes to the fresh market. And so yeah, what I'll say is uh you could do that where you leave half of the tree unpruned. The fig will do just fine. And you can even do something where you alternate. You go through hedge one side in one year, and then you let the other side grow, and then you cut back again on the other side and let the other side grow. I Yeah, that could be a way you can manage it. Um, Recommendations for treating pruning cuts. I'll go over that with diseases, but I highly doubt that anything is registered for figs. The best way of dealing with that is by not pruning when there's rain in the forecast. Part of the problem with fig production is that because it's so small, there are not very many products that are registered in general. Okay, irrigation. So there's little to no modern irrigation research. You may have heard that fig orchards need 2 acre-feet of water a year, but that is based off of dried fig production. And at least in California, that coincided with flood irrigation. So if you flood irrigate in a dried fig orchard, the two are antagonistic because your soil, you might be trying to flood when there's fruit on the ground. I guess you could try to come through it after you pick things up, but the soil might stay wet for a while and you have figs falling on it and they're picking up or sitting in water and they start rotting. So previously, irrigation practices were to really significantly curtail irrigation once the harvest season started. So that's where that 2 acre-feet of water a year came from. And we know the trees can survive it. But again, if you're trying to, depending on the market you're trying to get your figs into, you need to have fresh water available to get those fruit to size. So every fresh fig grower I've talked to thinks that fresh figs do require more water, but I just can't tell you what that is because there's not been any opportunity or funds available to do the research. So I can't tell you if it's 3 or 4 acre-feet. There's also not been really crop coefficients that I've been able to find in areas that kind of overlap with California. One study I found used a crop coefficient of 0.75, but I think they use that throughout the entire season. And so if anyone uses a crop coefficient to manage their irrigation, where you multiply the crop coefficient by whatever the evapotranspiration was that for that week to get the amount of water you apply, your crop coefficient isn't stagnant throughout the entire growing season. It's very small when the trees are just leafing out. It maximizes usually above 1 when the in the height of summer, and then it starts decreasing again as leaves fall off the tree. So I take that with a grain of salt. And again, we don't have stem water potential guidelines established, so we also don't have ways to manage irrigation based off of tree stress. And we have the same for fertilization. There's little to no modern fertilization research. And so this is an area because I am a plant nutritionist that I'm very interested in. I've tried actually very hard to put some guidelines together. And so what do I mean when I say modern fertilization research? I mean, so if you're managing almonds, for instance, you know how many pounds of nitrogen and potassium are shipped out of your orchard with every unit of marketable yield. So, almonds, 6 to 8 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 pound kernel yield. We know when demand starts, when demand levels off, and how much demand changes on a month-to-month basis. So I know, nitrogen uptake in almonds is a little bit sluggish, or it doesn't start until 75% leaf out. It's a little sluggish in the spring, but once that fruit starts to grow, nitrogen uptake is higher, and then it basically comes close to leveling off once kernel fill is completed. We don't have that for figs. When I tried to pull July leaf tissue standards, I had a really difficult, I couldn't pull any conclusions because no, people don't even sample the same types of tissues. So, when it comes to leaf tissue standards, it doesn't matter. I could have you select one type of leaf or another, but you have to have consistency across literature, just so you can have something that everyone agrees on. And that just doesn't exist from what I've seen. So the last California-based nitrogen research I found was from the 1950s when they were applying all of their nitrogen in the fall before the upcoming growing season, which anyone who's ever done their 4Rs should be cringing right now because you are risking losing all of that nitrogen and leaching it out over the winter. And that to me also raises now we know better. I don't know how much that nitrogen was lost, so I can't even say, the amounts that they're applying are actually accurate. So, um, and again, looking at other areas of the world, these are low input systems where they might be coming in and saying, oh, I applied X amount of pounds of nitrogen and potassium, but if the trees are very deficient, and they're getting yield increases, that's not the same as trying to maintain an orchard at a certain level. So what I can suggest is what's commonly cited, which is 50 to 70 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And this is going to be from a well-yielding orchard. I will say the habit of fig growth, where again, they're produced on current season's wood. You should split applications as evenly as possible between April and August. Even though fig maturity continues to happen after August, there's a little bit of shoot growth. There should still be residual nitrogen left in the soil that the fruits or the trees are picking up. You want to be careful because excess nitrogen has been linked to an increase in splitting and a reduction in fruit quality. And again, there's a wide range in leaf nitrogen levels, and there's no common sampling method, but two somewhat more reliable sources I think two sources that I think we could apply potentially to California production systems are one was 2%, one was 2.6%. To me, 2.6% does seem to be a little high. So I think between that range is probably okay. But don't quote me on that because again, the research for the way we do things here in California just doesn't exist. And we have unfortunately less information on potassium, despite how we know how important it is for fruit quality, and that it's linked to cracking. And of course, potassium deficient trees are going to defoliate, so you're increasing the risk of sunburn. So the study that I kind of mentioned earlier, where they were looking at the combo of potassium and potassium and calcium thiosulfate to try to increase yields, they did suggest a leaf tissue value above 2%, which I think it's a really good place to start. And how much potassium to apply? One study looked at they collected 10 tons of fresh fruit. They also collected everything they pruned off and a bunch of green fruit that didn't fully develop that season. And they came up with the rate of 44 pounds of K2O. Another study reported that figs are 1.5% potassium by dry weight, which may not be entirely helpful if you're selling fresh fruit. So again, my suggestion is to apply equal rates of nitrogen and K2O. But again, this is not really based off of, I'm being 100% frank, this is not based off of really strong research. So I just, the we just don't have the information we need to do modern fertilization practices. And as for their nutritional needs, yeah, they probably don't need boron because, again, there's no flower fertilization that happens. And maybe zinc. Zinc is known to be deficient in tree fruit systems based off of soil pHs in California tending to be above 7. But again, there's not a lot of research available. Okay, it looks like I'm running out of time. So I just wanted to mention, aside from black fig fly, a lot of the insects that attack figs are mostly found in dried fig production. I think that the thing you probably are going to deal with the most is birds, which I just don't think anyone has really good management guidelines for. They're really tough to control. Um, Diseases, you can get canker diseases from pruning, and you can get some diseases moving in from frost damaged branches. Again, I don't think that there's anything registered to treat pruning cuts with. So you just want to try to prune when there's no rain. So figs do leaf out in March. So at least in my neck of the woods, that tends to be when things start to dry out. But I know that rain happens a lot later into the spring in the Bay Area. So, um, but yeah, I would say if you have a time period where there's no rain in the 10-day forecast, that might be a good time to move in. I did want to mention, because I get questions about this, the fig mosaic virus, where you see mottling of early spring leaves, that it tends to clear out when it gets hot. It's probably vectored by the fig mite. It likely reduces yield when some more seasoned fig researchers mentioned it to me. They kind of had the attitude of like, well, all figs have it. There's no way to keep them from getting it. So, like, what can you do? I guess if figs were a huge crop, there might be more research in trying to eliminate this and get virus certified free stock and controlling the fig mite to try to prevent anything from happening. But I don't know. It just we just don't have guidelines. And again, it's I don't know how well you can keep it out of your orchard. Okay. I have 4 minutes for questions before I have to leave.
Thanks so much, Phoebe. That was awesome. So for anyone who has questions, please feel free to just unmute yourself, speak up. You can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat, whatever you want to do. Now is your chance.
I saw someone asked if a big grower sells grafted figs. Again, figs are not grafted onto rootstocks. I don't know if you're interested in commercial production, but I think Specialty Crop Company does sell nursery figs. If you're looking for something smaller, I'd say California Rare Fruit Growers is your best bet for getting unusual varieties.
I was just wondering while we wait for other folks, is there a commodity board or industry group at all for fig growers? Yeah, okay, cool, there is. Just wondering. Um, and do they fund research trials?
They do, but because like any other crop, they get their research funds from the amount of, I don't know what the amount is, but based off of how many fresh or dried figs they sell, it's just limited production is limited research dollars. So they've
Yeah.
also been directing the researches to the black fig fly, which is,
Mm,
I would say, a much more serious issue than, how
mm,
much potassium to apply to the
mm.
orchard.
Okay.
Okay, so someone was asking if fig pest or wasp, the people tell us is bad enough, so we should switch to cultivars that are resistant. Um, I'm not sure if that's the black fig fly. I've not heard of that. I mean, the black fig fly is bad, and Mel can um speak more to that, but I don't think there's anything that's resistant. Okay, yeah, I don't think there's anything resistant to the black fig fly. Best temperature to store figs at. I would have to get back to you, but off the top of my head, I would say as close to freezing as possible without freezing. Um, if I can share, or if Ellie can share my contact information, you can email me other questions, and I would be happy to look that up. So I'm giving you research backed information. Pictures of winter pruning of figs in an orchard. I have the old commercial fig production manual from the 1970s, so I could take that, I could send that to you if you want. Um, but I mean, I guess they're not pictures, they're illustrations, but I um, I can do that. So I will share my email. Yeah, thank you. So I have like a million talks this week. So if you guys want it, please, please, please do email me. I would love to share more information and answer your guys' questions. It's just email is how I keep track of things. And so if you, yeah, you just got to email me. How well will figs grow in heavy clay? I think they're going to struggle a little bit more because again, I don't know, nothing super likes heavy clay. But there is is that in a clay loam? I would say if you are good with irrigation and you make sure that you have a system that is not going to have water pool, they should be fine. Yeah, so again, if anyone wants the 1970s production manual, email me, I'll send it to you. Um, Okay. Well, I have to go teach about soils. So thank you so much for inviting me. I don't get to talk about figs very much, so this is a lot of fun. And thanks for all your questions, guys.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Phoebe. Round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great soils class.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye. Okay, and now we're gonna go hand things over to Mel. So I'm gonna make you a co-host, Mel, so that you can share your screen. If you
Great, thank
wanna
you.
just introduce yourself real quick while I do that, that would be
Yeah,
awesome.
for sure. I don't know if my video will stay on while I'm presenting. Sometimes our Wi-Fi is a little weird, but my name is Melissa or Mel. I am a second year graduate student in a PhD program at UC Riverside in the Department of Entomology. My project is centered around the black fig fly, and kind of like Phoebe has been saying, there's really not a lot of information about figs out there. And if there is information, it's not from California, or maybe it's from 70 years ago. And so we're kind of retry or we're opening up this new kind of can of worms here. So I'm excited to talk to y'all today about what we do know and then some things that we think might be possible for you to do as home growers. Let me open up my PowerPoint here and then I'll get started. But please feel free to like jump in, raise your hands, or actually maybe are talking like this, but I'll try to keep it open. Can you guys see my PowerPoint screen, or are you looking at that Fig textbook here?
Yeah, it looks good. We see your screen. We also see the PowerPoint slides on the left hand, like the next like 3 or 4 slides. But
Okay,
we do
so
see your title slide is like the big part.
okay, great. So let me see if I can open this guy up. Oopsie. All right, come in. Okay, so you guys can see. Okay, perfect.
Nice. Looks great.
Nice. Wonderful. All right. So today we're going to be talking about the black fig fly in California specifically. We're going to go over its management a little bit, but mostly talk about its biology. The best way to manage something is to know who and what it is. And so I'm trying to give you guys kind of a good background of that today. All right. Let's see. All right, before I get into like the meat and potatoes of my talk, I do want to just highlight that there are a lot of folks who have had their hands on this project, including our previous speaker, Phoebe Gordon, and a lot of other people in extension. So Sonia Rios, Ben Faber, David Haviland, and Neil McRoberts out at UC Davis. And then within our own team, we've had this project kind of pass through a few hands, including 2 postdocs that we've had in the lab, Katie Britt and Vale Ibrahimi, and now myself as most of my dissertation project. So this is going to be what we're going to go over today. First, we're going to meet the black fig fly so we kind of know who we're talking about before we get into the details. We'll talk about the black pig fly spread throughout the world and in California, our response in California as researchers and as just a community. Then we'll get into its biology, ecology, and then some signs that you may have infestation. Finally, we'll get into some management options and things that we think that might be helpful for y'all. And then I'll talk a little bit about what the future of the research looks like for the black fig fly. And like I said, just butt in with questions if you have them. I have the chat open, so I'll try to keep up with that too as we're going through. Also, if I'm going too fast, please let me know as well. It can mumble sometimes, I will say. All right. So one, let us meet the black fig fly here. So this is the insect that we are dealing with. It is in the order Diptera, which is the same order as all of the other flies. So those house flies that you see around your picnic, vinegar flies in your kitchen, all the same kind of order, the same group. But they are part of the family Loncheidae, which is very similar to our typical fruit flies that we see infesting fresh fruit, which we call the tephridids, I'm sorry. But it's in the same superfamily of Tephrotoidea. So essentially, many of these flies are infesting fresh plant tissues, just like the black pig fly. You can see that photo at the bottom right of a black pig fly literally laying eggs into the ostiole of the fig or the opening at the bottom of the fig. The figs or Ficus coerica. So it really does need these trees to go from its four life or go through its four life stages, its egg, larva, pupa, and adult. And we'll be talking about those different stages today and how we can manage each one of them. The adults are what you're going to probably be seeing the most, especially if you end up doing some sort of monitoring program. They are about 1 to 2 millimeters long, and they're kind of a black-green metallic color if you can get them underneath the scope. But one of the easiest ways that I have used to identify them are those bright red eyes. Not a lot of insects have those striking red eyes like the black fig fly does. Um, in addition to those red eyes, I also am looking at those kind of yellow tinted wings. But these things are pretty small, so you might need a little bit of magnification to help you out there. All right, so let's talk about the black fig fly spread. So we talked about where figs are from a little bit with Phoebe. The black fig fly, since it is intrinsically linked to the fig tree, is also native to the Mediterranean and Middle East area, where we've been cultivating those figs for thousands of years at this point. That cultivation has spread worldwide, as we've seen, and the black fig fly is kind of following suit. The first instance of it out of that area, it was found in 2007 in South Africa. It's also been found in places like Tunisia and Egypt, a little bit closer to its native range. But as of 2019 and 2020, it had been found in North America for the very first time in Mexico in some backyards in Veracruz. And after that, in 2021, we found it in the United States for the very first time in Ventura County, so in Southern California, more near me than y'all. So the arrival of the black fig fly was a bit of a shock for that small commercial fig industry. Like Phoebe mentioned, we have about 6,000 or 7,000 acres of commercial figs, all kind of centered in that Central Valley, in Merced, Madera, and Fresno, and you can see that acreage there. When we had the black fig fly first arrive in the state, we did a lot of delineation, which is essentially just setting up where its range is, trying to figure out if it had made it to the Central Valley or not. And at that point, we found that it was all throughout Southern California. So in Orange County, San Diego, Los Angeles, Riverside, all over. Since then, we have seen the spread kind of go up the central coast, so from Ventura all the way up to Santa Cruz, and then into the Bay Area, all the way into the Central Valley. And now, as of 2025, we found 2 black pig fly, one in Merced and one in Fresno. So now we do know it is in that commercial zone. I do want to note that the counties that are listed here have been certified all of the invasive flies for the state. So if you don't live in one of these counties and you do have black fig fly, it would be a really great help to us if you could send a sample to CDFA so we can update our map and make it more accurate for us. So that is just one thing to note here. So now we're going to move on to our response in California. So this is kind of running us back to 2019 and 2020. We're seeing reports from Mexico that people are seeing figs falling on the ground. They're finding these really weird worms in their figs, and they eventually find out that it is the black fig fly, or Silba adipata. In response to this, one of the branches of the USDA, which is called APHIS, started to increase irradiation of incoming fig fruits into the United States in order to slow that expansion into our fig producing areas. So in the spring of summer of 2021, unfortunately, that irradiation or that increased irradiation of incoming figs didn't really help slow it down too much. By 2021, we had seen a lot of infestation reports in Southern California, specifically in Ventura and Santa Barbara. And so that's where our initial surveys were done. And so you can see here our postdoc Katie Britt, as well as a farm advisor named Ben Faber down in Ventura County surveying for the black fig fly. They were looking all around figs off the side of highways, in commercial orchards, in people's backyards, anywhere they could find any figs to survey. And they did unfortunately find them at that point in time. And so for us, our first response was to create a black fig fly pest alert, literally just getting the word out to people that this might be in your backyard and to keep an eye out for it. And we made our own website as well on the UCA&R webpage. So if you're curious, you can visit that on your own. You can also use this QR code here to access the website. I see in the chat that someone has seen the black fig fly in Sebastopol, and I'm not surprised by that. I can send Ellie an email of where you can send those samples. That is through CDFA, not through myself. But they do have like a pest alert page themselves for invasive pests and things like that. So I can share that link with Ellie later. But thank you. We do need to be as accurate as possible. So if you do have more samples to send, please do. Okay, so after the black fig fly pest alert and website went out, we started really doing the research here, including that regional delineation, as well as working with people at UC Davis to predict the best places where the black fig fly could kind of persist in the state. And surprise, surprise, right where we are growing all of our commercial figs, that black fig fly would be right at home, based on that climate data. In addition to this delineation and modeling, we were also doing our trap and lure studies, which you can see that little asterisk there against spray trials. We haven't done any since 2024. That is really just because we were not able to do these trials on a large scale. And so our results are somewhat variable, I guess, from site to site. And we'll talk about that once we get to kind of our chemical control section. But let's get into the biology, ecology, and then the signs of infestation here for the black fig fly. So the black fig fly overwinters as a pupa in the soil. And if you're farther up north, this pupation period will be longer, longer than what I will show you in the next slide here for their phenology. But essentially, they do overwinter as pupa when the temperatures drop. Once it kind of warms up in the springtime, the adults will begin to emerge and mate, and then they will start to oviposit or lay their eggs into unripe figs. And we underline unripe here because they really do prefer a very small, green, hard fig to oviposit into. Although I will be talking about my research later, but we're going to try to really pinpoint when they are starting to infest those figs. But you can see an example of that here on the right side of the page. You can see those eggs in the ostiole. They're kind of a milky white color. You can see that female again laying eggs into the ostiole. Once those eggs hatch, the larvae will then emerge and then feed on the synconium of the fig, so the inner flesh of the fig, like Phoebe was talking about. You can see that larval tunneling in those photos at the bottom, so you can see that feeding damage and then the larval exit hole. Once the larvae are done feeding, they use that exit hole to emerge from the fruit, drop to the soil, and then pupate. They either pupate on top of the soil or in the soil. In more rare cases, they have been seen to pupate inside of the fig, although I'm not sure if they can really make it out as adults because they have to chew their way out, and their mouth parts have totally changed once they reach that adult state. Based on some papers from Greece, from I think the 1980s, we believe that there's about 4 to 6 individual generations a year for the black pig fly, although the degree days are unknown. For those who don't know, entomologists use degree days to calculate certain emergences or certain activity periods of insects. Basically, how much heat has accumulated over time, and that will help tell us when they will be more active. We haven't done this research for the black fig fly, but we figure that since we do live in a Mediterranean climate as well, we probably do have around 4 to 6 generations a year as well. And so moving on to this here, this is actually what we see for the activity of the black fig fly in Southern California and the Central Coast, and then a little bit shorter of a time in the Central Valley. But here you can see our activity for the year. I do want to point out also that the density of black pig fly are very different in these different places. So do take a look at that x-axis or that vertical axis there, or sorry, that y-axis, the vertical axis there. You can see that Southern California reaches a peak about 100. Central Coast is a lot denser and the Central Valley is a lot lower. But even though the population densities are quite different in between these sites, we can see that they have a similar pattern that they follow. So towards the late part of the spring and early summer, the black pig fly really start to pick up their activity depending on when it gets really warm. So for Southern California, that is June. Central Coast is also around June. The Central Valley is a little bit ahead of us with that heat. But you can see a few months later, we have our highest peak here in November and October for the Southern California Central Coast, and it will likely be the same or similar for the Bay Area since you guys follow a very similar climate to the Central Coast here, although albeit colder. In the Central Valley, we have it moved up a little bit sooner because that cumulative heat days really kind of smushes itself up. It gets very hot very quickly there. And so basically you're seeing that once it gets warmer in the year, the black pig fly will become more active. And then once it gets cooler towards, let's say December, January, you won't see a lot of activity. And this activity is based off of Torula yeast baited traps. And we'll talk about that once we get to the management part. So now let's get into signs of damage and infestation. So one really obvious sign of damage is that you'll see eggs in the ostiole. The eggs are that milky white color. They're very oblong. They look sort of like rice, if you can see that there. Along with the eggs in the ostiole, you'll also see maggots or those worms inside of your fruit. You can see those larval tunnels here. They've kind of oxidized and turned brown, and so that is also a very obvious sign that you will have black fig fly in those fruit or in your orchard. Something that's a little bit less obvious that I noticed while working in the orchard last year is that infested fruit kind of turn this funny ripe color. So I mentioned earlier that when the black fig fly infests the fruit, it is unripe, it is very small, and it seems to arrest the development of the fruit at a certain point. And so you can see here, this is a black or purple variety of fig. But this fruit is very small. It is about 1 to 2 inches in length, but is a fully ripe color, that full black ripe color. And it is totally infested with these the black fig fly on the inside. Looking fruit are exit holes, so that's a good sign that there are black fig fly that have exited the fruit. They also really easily fall off the tree, and I have a little bit of a video example of that after I show you what the yellow or green varieties of figs look like when they're infested. So let's see that now. So it's a little bit harder to see that ripe color with these green varieties of figs, but they do turn this yellowy color. Again, they are that same similar length, 1 to 2 inches in length. They turn that ripened color while still fully unripe on the inside. You'll see some exit holes occasionally, and these really easily fall off the tree. There will be no latex when you break them off. And so let me show you my video of that. I hope this works here. All right, so I found an unripe fig that I think was infested with the black fig fly. And so I was trying to show you here how easily it breaks off. It also breaks off and there is no latex at the neck of the fig, which is really, really unusual. So that fruit was likely going to fall off. And so let me show you what that premature fruit drop looks like. Okay, so one of the first signs that we noticed when people were telling us about the new black fig fly infestation in California and in Mexico was that there was a lot of premature fruit drop. And a lot of fruit trees do this. It's like a self-pruning thing. Sometimes they just can't bear all of the fruit that they have. But this was inordinate amounts of fruit dropping off the tree. And they all looked very similar. They were that similar 1 to 2 inches in length. And they were all that really strange ripe color while being unripe. And so you can see some examples of that here. I did notice that this was way less common in the Breva, and I think thinking back to those phenology graphs, the black fig fly just was not active in that time of the year yet. So I did see a lot of this fruit fall off between July and August, at least in San Diego. And so you'll see a lot of this unripe fruit on the ground. And this is one of the most important parts of management is picking this up. And we'll talk about this right now. So now on to BFF management or black fig fly management. I want to take an integrated pest management approach here. There's a lot of different definitions for integrated pest management depending on like what you're growing and who you're working with. But in this case, I just want it to mean that we're going to be using a multitude of strategies to reduce black fig fly population with a lot of sorry, with a lot of emphasis being placed on the prevention components. So to begin with prevention, and sometimes we call this cultural control, our overall goal here is to really make your figs inaccessible and to physically disrupt the black fig fly's life cycle. And so there are two main ways that we can do this. The first thing that you can do is to exclude the black fig fly, to basically block them from that ostiole where they will lay eggs. So we've recommended netting trees, although figs do get very large and grow very fast, so maybe netting individual branches. I know a lot of folks with just one tree, have been able to bag individual fruits at that very small unripe phase, and they have been able to save some of their fruits this way. And then finally, putting tarps underneath the trees. This is kind of, or it has two benefits there. One benefit is that you can pick up your fallen fruit more easily, which leads us to the sanitation bit. And then the second benefit is that the tarp will disrupt that black fig fly life cycle of burrowing into the soil. So as we move on to sanitation, I just want to say that this is probably the most important part of at least disrupting the black fig fly life cycle. And so sanitation is really just a fancy word here for tidying up. But this is really picking up that fallen fruit, and the tarps can help, but you can also just do this by hand as well. One of the most important parts of sanitation, though, is the proper disposal of those fruits. So after you've picked up the fruit, you do need to properly dispose of it. And by that, I mean that you need to make sure that the larvae in the fruit are killed, essentially. You can do this by freezing the fruit, and I've recommended a minimum of 3 days or up to a week of freezing. You can also microwave it, and this works much more quickly than freezing, but you will end up with like a hot pile of fruit full of maggots, which is not super, it's not super fun. So I would go the freezing way. Some people have asked about like destroying or chopping up the fruit, and you can grind the fruit down, but you need to make sure that you've ground it down very finely in order to make sure that you have killed those maggots in the fruit. I've gotten a lot of questions about composting. I am a big proponent of composting. I love the idea of recycling nutrients when you can, but do be aware that you do need to either freeze, microwave, or properly destroy the fruit before putting it in your compost pile. And even then, please bury that fruit as deep down in the pile as you can, just to prevent any larvae from emerging and pupating and then emerging as adults to finish out that life cycle. So just to kind of reiterate, the prevention here is either excluding or both excluding the black pig fly from the fruit and making sure that you properly sanitize your orchard by picking up those infested fruit. So for monitoring and management, there are a few options here. None of them are very like targeted for the black pig fly, although we're working on that, and I'll show you that in the next slide here. But we recommend right now to use McPhail type traps, which are these liquid-based traps. You can see a photo of one on the lower left-hand side. Typically, what we recommend is to bait them with Tarula yeast tablets. Do not be like this person holding them in the middle. Wear gloves when you do handle these Tarula yeast tablets. They typically have borax in them, but we use about 4 tablets per 400 milliliters of water. You can use or you can leave these out for up to a week, up to a month. The real thing that you're fighting here is just the bait drying out. So do just make sure that it is still liquid and able to attract the flies here. This point on the bottom, the 2% ammonium sulfate solution mixed with some fig sap in the bottom of the pan trap paired with a hexanol lure is more targeted, but it is a little bit harder to assemble. So you do have to make your own ammonium sulfate solution. You also have to pick the figs off and collect that fig sap to mix with the solution in the bottom of the pan. And then you have to get your own hexanol. And we've made our own little hexanol dispenser here. But now I think there are a few different commercial, basically producers that make little hexanol packages. I cannot speak to how well those packages work, but our hexanol, like little modified film canister there, does work pretty well. And sometimes the black pig fly even land into the canister as well. Okay, I see a question in the chat. It says, have colonies proven to be any effective control in orchards? And then have any orchards introduced bat colonies for controlling black pig fly populations? I don't think that anyone has tried anything to do with bats for control for black pig fly, although the black pig fly are active during the day. And so bats typically are hunting during the night using echolocation. And so I'm not sure if bats would be super helpful for that. They would be helpful though for the navel orange worm, which Phoebe mentioned as a pest of the of figs in general. The hexanol does not directly kill the flies, although if they land in it, they do sink. And so they're just really attracted to that smell. The hexanol is a part of the plant volatiles that are released from the latex. And so let me talk about that really quick. So our 2025 lure study showed a lot of promising results. You can see our graph here where we were comparing 8 different treatments. Basically, what we found is that the Tarula yeast is really attractive to the black pig fly, so those tablets that I showed you in the last slide, but there's a lot of high non-target insects that end up in those traps, so insects that we don't necessarily want in there. We did find that a combination of 2 different volatiles, so the hexanol as well as a volatile called germicrene D, is really attractive for the black pig fly and selective. And you can see the comparison between the 2 traps at the bottom. The Tarula yeast is kind of gummed up with those non-target insects. Well, you can kind of count every individual black pig fly in that water in the trap to the right side. And so I do want to say that there is some hope on the horizon for at least the lure and trap system here. But it will come soon commercially, maybe within the next 2 or 3 years. Okay, so now to chemical control and back to that asterisk that I mentioned earlier in the talk. So we have done a few different spray trials that have really yielded inconsistent results. But if you do want to chemically treat for black pig fly, we believe that GF120, which is a spinosad-based product, it's basically a protein bait, would be targeted or good for the black pig fly to target the adults. You could also try something called Delegate 250, which is a spinetoram-based product. This is also, I think, OMRI certified, but I would have to check on that. Phoebe did mention that there are not a lot of chemical controls that are registered for figs, and so we're not really working with a big variety of chemical products here. And so the best thing that you can really do is that preventative and cultural control work, as well as the detection and management component, to really try to keep your black fig fly populations down. And so I just want to quickly go over future research, and then I'll open it up for questions. But essentially, my whole dissertation is based around the black fig fly here. And so my first chapter will be talking, or will be refining that trap and lure system, using that germicrene D and hexanol to really kind of hone in on what components we need to trap a lot of black fig fly while being really selective for it as well. So looking at soil factors that affect the pupation success and emergence of adults. And then finally, I'll be looking at that infestation kind of activity throughout the year and what kind of figs they are really attracted to, or if they have any preferences at one point in the season versus another. And so that's it for my future research there. With that, I'd just like to say thank you. There were a lot of folks who had their hands in these projects and a lot of people who still do. And so if you have any questions for myself, please feel free to ask them there or ask them here, or you can also email me as well. I'm seeing a few questions in the chat. So if you do have any questions, let me answer these first and then I'll get to yours. Okay. The first question I have is from John, or maybe it's more of a comment. It says taping over the osteo with high quality duct tape has been 100% effective in preventing egg laying. Um, you don't have to remove any bags for the extended harvest season. And then a preliminary experiment spraying with kaolin clay to plug the ostiole has also been effective in preventing egg laying. So that's great. I have heard of people taping over the ostioles with just regular Scotch tape, and that hasn't worked as well, but I will let them know about the duct tape because a lot of folks are not a big fan of using those bags. It takes a lot of bags. Figs bear a lot of fruit, and so if you can just kind of tape them up, that would be great. Okay, Brian asks for netting, what mesh size is necessary to be effective at excluding the flies? I'm not sure about the mesh size right off the top of my head, but if you can get a really close mesh, like something like organza, that would definitely keep them out. I'm not sure about like what the maximum size you could have would be right off the top of my head. Okay. Ginny asks, is there any research being done on developing new varieties of figs that are resistant to the black fig fly? Not to my knowledge. There are not there are not any varieties that are resistant. A lot of folks were thinking that figs with smaller osteoles would be safer, although there isn't any research to back that at the moment. So really, it probably would be in your best interest to just try those prevention techniques rather than looking for varieties of figs that claim to be resistant from the black fig fly, because I haven't seen any, at least in studies, that do that. But if anybody else has any questions, please let me know. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mel. I really appreciate it. Really great presentation. Love all the visuals. Maybe let's give folks one more minute. I know it's 3 o'clock, but I think you mentioned you might have a minute or two.
Oh,
I
there
think
you
you
are.
might be.
Sorry.
That's okay. I don't know if it was me or you, but I think you might have been frozen for a second there. I'm not sure.
No, it's all good. But thank you for having me so much. I appreciate y'all.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Lots of applause. Oh my gosh, so much applause.
Thank you.
That's really nice. Thanks, everyone.
Hmm.
Okay, oh, here we go. Another question from Ginny in the chat.
Okay, let's see. Is there any study on how figs are developed from one another? Um, I don't know what you mean by that. Like, are like between like the Calimyrna figs or different types? Oh, like from varieties and breeding? Is that what you mean, Jenny? Um, To my knowledge, there probably are quite a few, but I am not like a botanist in that sense. But I can probably find a few things for you if you're interested. Okay. Ginny, if you can send me an email, that would be great. I'm gonna put my email in the chat here, and then I'll find a few articles for you. Please mention my collaboration with smaller growers and amateur fig groups. Oh yeah, I mean, there's um I work with a small grower down in San Diego for most of my work for the lure work. But everybody that I've kind of run into has had a lot of good things to say, as well as tips for the black fig fly here. And my first talk ever was actually with the California rare fruit growers, so I do appreciate a lot of those smaller growers out there for sure.
Thanks. And I just put a link in the survey, a link to an evaluation survey in the chat. So that's just a really quick form that you can fill out. I know it says peach in the title. I just changed it. It should say fig. Everything else in there says fig. We did a previous workshop on or webinar on peaches as well. So anyway, it's the same form as with all my other webinars. I just forgot to change peach. So everything else says fig on all the questions. So if you could, I did just update it too. So hopefully that's reflected. If you could please very briefly fill that out. I promise it's just like a minute or two, and it just tells us how this went for you, what you liked, if you learned anything, if you have any feedback. So yeah, I'll include that in the follow-up email. I'll also include Mel and Phoebe's email addresses and links to various helpful fig things too. So yeah, let's see. Maybe one more. There might be one more question in the chat from Kate.
Um, okay, how does I've seen some folks like wrapping their trees, but I'm not sure about that answer specifically. That might be something better for fig forums. I will say that there are a lot of growing forums online and the fig folks are very active. And so if you have any questions about specifically growing your figs, especially in specific regions of the state, there are lots of folks who will help you online too.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think with that, unless anyone has any other pressing questions, I think we'll wrap up.
All right.
Okay, thank you
Thank
all so
you.
much. And thanks, Mal, for being here. I hope you have a great rest of your PhD experience. I love
Thank you.
how well structured and like clearly outlined your sections are. So yeah, it just sounds like really exciting work. So best of luck with all of your research.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, have a good one.
All
Bye,
right, you too.
everybody.
Bye,
Take
y'all.
care.